When peace feels unfamiliar, restoration begins here. This is P.I.P.E Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the P.I.P.E Podcast. I'm Ann, and today I want to talk about something that took me many years to understand. The things we never said out loud. There were many things I kept inside and never talked about. Things I was feeling, things that hurt me, things I was confused about, things I needed help with. But I grew up believing you kept those things to yourself. You smiled, you pushed through it, you handled it. And no matter what happened, you got back up and kept moving. I was taught that if you fell down, you got back up. If you were hurting, you hid it. If life was hard, you carried it quietly. And if you were struggling, you certainly didn't talk about it. That mindset wasn't unique to me. It was passed down through generations. Many of us were taught that showing emotion was weakness, that asking for help meant you weren't strong enough, that if you just worked harder and stayed quiet, everything would eventually work itself out. So that's exactly what I did. I smiled when I was hurting. I pretended I was okay when I wasn't. I became very good at convincing other people that everything was fine. The problem was, I eventually started believing my own performance. When you spend enough years pretending you're okay, you lose touch with what you're actually feeling. You stop asking yourself hard questions. You stop paying attention to your own wounds. You stop noticing how much pain you're carrying. And eventually, that pain starts showing up in places you never expected. Looking back, I can see that many of the things I was taught weren't really rooted in love. They were rooted in control. I was taught not to question authority, not to talk back, to respect my elders even when they were wrong. Now, don't misunderstand me. Respect does matter, but respect and silence are not the same thing. There wasn't always room for healthy conversations. There wasn't always room for honesty. There wasn't always room for feelings. And while I didn't like how those things made me feel, I ended up passing some of those same patterns down to my own children. That is difficult to admit, but healing requires honesty. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was teaching strength. I thought I was preparing my children for life. As a single parent, I carried a lot. I was responsible for discipline. I was responsible for encouragement. I was responsible for providing. I was responsible for teaching right from wrong. And I was doing all of that while carrying wounds I had never healed. Looking back, one of the biggest mistakes I made was trying to raise healthy children while I was still an unhealthy version of myself. Not because I didn't love them, because I loved them deeply. Because unhealed people often pass down pain they never intended to pass down. We teach what we know, even when what we know isn't healthy. For years, I stayed stuck in those patterns. I told myself, This is just who I am. Maybe you said that too. Like, I'm too old to change. I've always been this way. That's just my personality. But I've learned something important. Those statements keep us trapped. Because growth doesn't stop when we get older. Healing doesn't have an age limit. And change is possible if we're willing to be honest. For me, the healing started when I was finally willing to face the woman in the mirror. Not blaming everyone else, not point fingers, not justify my behavior. Just honestly looking at myself. That wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I had to admit there were areas where I needed to grow. I had to admit some of my ways weren't working. I had to admit that my way or the highway was creating distance in relationships that I cared about. And then I had to make a choice. Stay the same or change. I chose to change. I chose healing. I chose to let God rebuild the parts of me that had been operating in survival mode for decades. Little by little, He began showing me healthier ways to communicate, healthier ways to love, healthier ways to respond, healthier ways to listen. One of the most important parts of that process was learning to forgive myself, because for a long time, I carried shame over my mistakes. I carried regret over things I wish I had done differently. But eventually I realized something. I was doing the best I could with what I knew at the time. That doesn't excuse everything, but it does allow room for grace. I survived things that hurt me. I experienced abuse. I experienced shame. I experienced disappointment. But staying stuck in those experiences wasn't helping me heal. Pretending I was okay wasn't helping me heal. Holding everything inside was not helping me heal. Healing finally began when I started telling the truth. First to myself, then to God, and then to the people that I love. One thing I've learned through all of this is that healing isn't just about what you let go of. It's also about what you connect yourself to. For years, I was plugged into fear. I was plugged into old wounds. I was plugged into survival mode. I was plugged into resentment, disappointment, and pain. And when that's what you're connected to every day, it eventually starts shaping the way you think, the way you speak, and the way you react. That's why I talk so much about positive energy. Not because life is always positive. Not because we pretend hard things don't exist. Because life is hard. People do hurt us. We make mistakes. We experience loss, disappointment, regret, grief. But we still have a choice. We can choose what we allow to influence us. We can stay plugged into old hurts, or we can plug into healing. We can stay plugged into anger, or we can plug into peace. We can stay plugged into fear, plug into faith. I've learned that before I speak, before I react, before I make a decision, I need to stop and ask myself, what am I connected to right now? Because whatever you're plugged into will eventually come out of you. And these days, I'm working hard to stay connected to God's peace, God's wisdom, God's love, and God's purpose for my life. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And that intentional choice has changed my life. Today, life feels different. Not perfect, but different. Lighter, brighter, more peaceful. As I allow God to rebuild me and put me back together again, I can see healthy changes happening in my relationships with family and friends. The healing didn't happen overnight, but it started the moment I stopped pretending and started being honest. The things we never say out loud have power over us. But once we bring them into the light, they begin to lose that power. Maybe today you're carrying something you never said out loud. Maybe you've been smiling through pain. Maybe you've convinced yourself you're fine because that's what you always done. If that's you, I want to encourage you to start being honest with yourself. Healing begins with truth. It's never too late to grow. It's never too late to change. And it's never too late to become healthier than you've ever been before. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And remember, here at P.I.P.E, we believe what you plug into matters. Because what you connected to will either build your life or break it. So choose carefully. Choose healing. Choose peace. Choose faith. Choose growth. And most importantly, choose to plug into positive energy. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for sitting with us today, where restoration begins.